Constance Fowler left the ore docks at Duluth on the morning of the 7th of November, 1913, with 600 feet of iron ore in her belly, and a sky the color of old pewter pressing down on the whole of Superior. Frank Dolan had been up since 4. He had the coffee going before the deckhands were out of their bunks, and he had the porridge on the back burner, and the bread from the previous evening sliced, and set out on the long wooden board that ran the length of the galley table. He worked in the dark mostly, by feel and habit, the way a man works when he has done the same thing in the same small room for more years than he cares to count. The galley was below decks, forward of the engine room, and it smelled of rendered fat and coal smoke and the particular metallic dampness that belonged to the lake in November. There was a porthole above the sink, small and circular, and through it Frank could see the dock lights of Duluth going past as the ship was nudged out into the slip by the tug. He watched them without expression. He had watched a great many dock lights go past in his time. He had watched the lights of Superior and Ashland and Marquette, and the Sioux and a dozen smaller ports he could barely name anymore. And the lights always looked the same from a porthole, small and yellow and indifferent, like eyes that had already looked away. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the porthole and watched the city fall away behind them. The tug had released them now, and the Fowler's engines had taken hold, and the familiar vibration ran up through the deck plating and into the soles of Frank's feet. And he felt it the way a man feels a thing he has felt so many times it has become a part of his body, indistinguishable from his own heartbeat. He was 54 years old. He had been cooking on the lakes since he was 19. He was not a large man, but he was broad across the shoulders, and his hands were remarkable, thick and scarred. The knuckle of the right index finger permanently swollen from a burn he'd gotten in the galley of the Priscilla Ames in 1901. And they moved with an economy that spoke of long practice and a certain contempt for wasted motion. His hair was gray at the temples and white at the back, and he wore it cut short because longer hair caught the steam from the pots. His face was not a young man's face, but it was not the face of an old man either. It was a face that had been worked on by weather and by worry and by the particular kind of loneliness that comes from spending most of your life among men you like well enough, but will never truly know. The Fowler picked up speed as she cleared the breakwater and moved into the open lake. Frank felt the hull shift as she met the first real swells, and he put one hand on the edge of the stove and steadied himself without looking up from the coffee. Inside the porthole, there was nothing now but dark water and dark sky, and somewhere in between them, though he couldn't see it, the horizon. Breakfast was at 6:30. The first watch came in from the deck smelling of cold and lake spray, their faces red and their hands stiff, and they sat down at the table without ceremony and ate with their heads bent over their plates the way men eat when they are cold and tired and have no particular interest in conversation. Frank served them without speaking much himself. There was a rhythm to it that required no words. The ladle going into the porridge, the bread passed down the table, the coffee poured, and the cups taken up and set down again. The Fowler carried a crew of 22. There was the captain, Harlan Moswick, who ate alone in his quarters and had his meals brought up by the cabin boy. A 17-year-old from Two Harbors named Erickson, who Frank had taken a mild and impersonal liking to, mostly because the boy was quiet and did what he was asked and did not pretend to understand things he didn't understand. There were 2 mates, the chief engineer, 3 oilers, a wheelsman, a watchman, and deckhands enough to work the oar hatches and handle the lines. Most of them Frank knew by name and by the particular shape of their appetites. This one ate quickly and without pleasure. That one always asked for more bread. Another had a stomach complaint that flared up in rough weather and required a plain diet of crackers and broth. The first watch finished eating and went back to their posts, and the second watch came in. Frank washed the first round of dishes in the aluminum sink while the second watch ate, listening to the sound of their voices rise and fall behind him. They were talking about the weather. "Glass is low," said Koppinen, who was the wheelsman and a Finn from Houghton, who had been on the lakes since before Frank. He was talking to no one in particular. The way a man states a fact he wants acknowledged without making a point of demanding acknowledgement. Fell 2/10 overnight. Always falls in November, said Riady, who was a deckhand and young enough that he said things like that. Things that were true as far as they went, but didn't go anywhere near far enough. Fell 2/10, Koppinen said again. Frank went on washing dishes. He didn't turn around. Through the porthole, the sky had lightened from black to a deep and uncertain gray, and the swells were running longer now, with more weight behind them. The kind of swells that don't mean anything in themselves, but come before things that do. He had seen that sky before. He had seen it in October of 1905 and in November of 1909, and what it had looked like in both of those cases before the weather came was very much like what it looked like now. He set a clean cup on the drain board and picked up the next one. By mid-morning, the Fowler was out past the Apostle Islands and running northeast on a heading for Whitefish Bay. And Frank had finished with the breakfast things and begun his preparations for the noon meal. He worked methodically, without hurry, reducing a ham bone to stock and slicing onions for a soup, and rolling out a pastry dough for the hand pies he made on long passages, because they were easy for the men to eat while standing a watch. The galley was warm from the stove and close from the low overhead, and he worked with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows. At 10 o'clock, he went up on deck for 15 minutes. He did this every morning when the weather permitted, partly for the air, and partly because he believed, without having examined the belief too closely, that a man who stayed below all day became something less than himself. He stood at the rail on the port side, amidships, and looked out at the lake. What he saw troubled him in a way he didn't immediately articulate, even to himself. The swells were coming in long, smooth, deliberate rolls from the northwest, and they were running 7 feet or better already, which was not unusual for November. But the interval between them was wrong, too long, too even, as though the lake were breathing slowly and carefully, the way a man breathes when he is trying to control something. The sky had changed since dawn. The cloud layer had dropped and thickened, and the light had a flat, yellowish quality that Frank associated with specific kinds of trouble. The kind that didn't announce itself with any particular drama, but simply arrived, all at once and everywhere, like a conclusion that had been foregone, since, before the question was asked, he stood there for a while, watching the water. The wind was from the northwest, and running at perhaps 20 miles per hour, not enough to be alarming, not enough for most men on the ship to remark upon. But there was something in it, some quality of persistence, some hint of the distances it had traveled over and the distances it had still to go, that a man who knew this lake recognized and could not quite explain to a man who didn't. Frank had been trying to explain things about this lake to men who didn't understand it for 35 years. He had mostly given up. The lake did not reward explanation. It rewarded attention, and even that only so far. He looked northwest, where the clouds were thickest, then turned and looked back at the Pilothouse. Then he went below and put the hand pies in the oven. He had been 19 years old when he first went onto the lakes in the spring of 1878. He had come up from Chicago with the intention of working the season, just the one, just enough to get ahead of the debt his father had left when he died, and then going back and finding work ashore. He had done the same thing every spring for 35 years. He had never gone back, not for lack of wanting to. In the early years, he had wanted very badly to go back. There was a woman in Chicago named Catherine Marin who had waited for him through the first 2 seasons, and then written him a letter that was kind in its way but final, and married a hardware man named Scott. Frank had heard through his sister that they had 4 children, and that Scott had done well enough. He bore Scott no ill will. He bore the lake no ill will either, though it had taken more from him than Catherine Marin. It had taken things that could not be measured against hardware and 4 children, and a decent life on solid ground. He had married, eventually, a woman named Ruth Eberl from Superior, who had understood from the beginning what kind of life she was agreeing to, and had not complained about it, at least not more than was reasonable. They had 2 children, a son named George, who worked in the shipyards at Superior, and a daughter named Clara, who had married a teacher and moved to Minneapolis. Frank and Ruth lived in a small house on the east side of Superior that smelled in November of the wood stove Ruth kept going from October through April. He thought of that smell sometimes, standing in front of his own stove in the galley of whatever ship he was on. It was the same kind of warmth, but it was not the same. Ruth had asked him, the previous spring, whether he thought he might retire from the lakes at the end of the season. She had asked him this before, over the years, with varying degrees of urgency, and he had always said he would think about it, and had gone back out in April. This time she had asked differently, without urgency, without pressure. and that had troubled him more than the urgency would have. She was 60 years old. She was not well, though she did not speak of it in those terms. There were doctors, and there were things the doctors said that Frank mostly heard secondhand because Ruth did not want to frighten him. And what frightened him was that she thought he could be frightened. He was not a man who was frightened easily. This was, he had come to understand, not entirely a virtue. He thought about her now, standing at the stove, stirring the soup stock, and watching the fat rise to the surface in slow amber circles. He thought about the house and the wood stove and the way she looked in the mornings when she brought coffee out to him if he was in the backyard doing something. The way she held the cup with both hands because her hands were always cold. He thought about these things the way he thought about the lake when he was ashore, not with longing exactly, but with the attentiveness of a man who suspects he may be seeing something for the last time. He skimmed the fat and put the lid on the pot. Noon, the soup was served and the bread distributed, and the second round of dishes washed and stacked. Frank ate his own meal standing at the counter, the way he always did when the men were at the table. Not because there was no room to sit, but because he had gotten into the habit years ago of eating in a way that allowed him to monitor the pot and the kettle and the state of the bread without ceremony. He ate quickly and without particular pleasure. He had been cooking for other men so long that eating had become largely administrative, a matter of fuel and function rather than enjoyment. After the dishes, he went back up on deck, and this time he stayed longer. The lake had changed in the 2 hours since his morning break. The swells were running 10 feet now, and the Fowler was beginning to work in them. That slight rolling motion, slow and deep, that meant the hull was experiencing the full weight of the water, and not merely the surface of it. The wind had picked up, 15 to 25, gusting. The sky was lower. The color of the water had changed from the deep blue-black of open Superior in normal conditions to something darker and more opaque. A green-gray that Frank had seen before, and that he thought of, when he thought of it at all, as the lake's own color. The color it was when it stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. He found Capstan at the stern, smoking a pipe with his back to the wind. Capstan was 62, and had the kind of face that certain Finnish men develop over a lifetime of looking at whether watchful, economical, giving nothing away while missing nothing. Northwest, Frank said. Northwest. Capstan agreed. They stood without speaking for a while. The ship rose on a swell and came down the other side with a sound that was not quite a crash and not quite a groan, but something in between, and both men shifted their weight automatically to accommodate it. "What's the glass at?" Frank asked. 29 and falling. "How fast?" Capstan looked at him sideways. "Fast enough." Frank looked at the northwest horizon, which was dark in a way that was not attributable to cloud cover alone, a darkness that had depth to it, a darkness that was also a kind of presence. He had seen that darkness before. He had seen it in October of 1905 on the Mataafa, though he hadn't been on the Mataafa himself. He had been on the dock at Duluth that night, watching. He had watched 2 ships go to pieces on the piers in the worst storm Superior had produced in 30 years. watched good men he knew die within sight of the harbor lights, and there was nothing any man on the dock could do but stand there in the wind and the snow and the spray and watch. The helplessness of it had stayed with him for years, longer than the grief. The grief receded. The helplessness did not. "You going to say something to Moswick?" Coppinen asked. "What would I say?" "Nothing, I suppose." "Nothing," Frank agreed. He knocked his hands against each other once, reflexively, for warmth, and went back below. Captain Harlan Moswick was 48 years old, and he had been master of the Constance Fowler for 6 seasons. Before that, he had been first mate on the Hawgood and the William Nottingham, and before that he had sailed as an ordinary seaman on the old wooden hookers that worked the lower lakes in the 1880s. He was not, by any objective measure, a careless man. He was not a reckless man. He was a man who had made a calculation, as captains on the lakes made calculations every November. A calculation that weighed the evidence of the weather against the needs of the shipping company and the obligations of schedule against the weight of experience, and came up with a number that he believed justified proceeding. The number did not account for everything. Numbers rarely did. Frank brought the captain's noon meal to his quarters himself, as he usually did. Moswick sat at his desk with the chart spread out and his reading glasses on, and he did not look up when Frank came in. Frank set the tray on the corner of the desk, soup, bread, a wedge of cheese, coffee, and was turning to go when Moswick said, without looking up from the chart, "Weather Service posted an advisory this morning. Low pressure system moving from the northwest." "Yes, sir," Frank said. "We'll be in Whitefish Bay by early tomorrow if the engines hold. Once we're past the point, we'll have the shelter of the shore." Frank stood with his hand on the door frame. He looked at the captain's profile, the short gray beard, the reading glasses sitting low on a heavy nose, the set of the shoulders that said this is decided, and I am not asking for opinions. "Yes, sir," Frank said. "You have a question, Dolan." Frank considered. He had worked on this lake long enough to know that what he knew about weather was not welcome in the Pilothouse, and had never been welcome in any pilothouse he had worked below, not because the captains were stupid men, but because the system of authority on a ship required that certain kinds of knowledge belonged to certain people, and that a cook's knowledge of weather, however hard one, was not officially a relevant kind of knowledge. He had made his peace with this, more or less. He had made his peace with a great many things. "No, sir," he said. He went back down the companionway to the galley, and the ship rose on a long swell and came down the other side, and the soup on the stove moved in its pot with a slow, rocking motion. And Frank put his hand on the edge of the counter and watched it move. That afternoon, he wrote a letter to Ruth. He wrote it at the galley table after the afternoon cleanup, in the hour between the noon meal and the preparation of supper. The closest thing he had to a private hour on a working ship. He wrote in pencil on pages torn from the small notebook he kept in the pocket of his cook's jacket, and used primarily for inventory lists and provisioning notes. He did not write about the weather. He wrote about what he intended to do when he got back to Superior, which was not much. There was a section of fence in the backyard that had been needing attention since August, and he wanted to do that. And he thought if the weather held, they might drive up to see Clara and her husband in Minneapolis before the real winter set in. He wrote about these things in the careful, slightly formal way he wrote everything, which was the way a man writes when he learned to write as an adult, and never quite lost the sense that writing was a conscious and laborious act rather than a natural one. He did not write, "I am watching a sky that I have seen twice before in my life, and both times men died." He did not write, "The barometer has dropped 3/10 since we left Duluth, and the northwest horizon looks like something that has been building for a long time." He did not write, "I think about the Mataafa. I think about it more than I used to," he wrote. "The weather is lively, but we expect to make the Sioux by Friday. I hope your cough is better. Tell George I said hello if you see him. I will be home by the weekend." He read it back once, and then folded it and put it in the notebook. He would mail it from the Sioux. He had mailed a great many letters from the Sioux over the years. It was one of the last places on the upper lakes where a man could still feel, briefly, like a man with a regular life. A post office, dry land, the sound of people who were not going anywhere, outside the porthole. The lake was heaving in long, dark rolls. The evening meal was a pork roast with potatoes and carrots and a brown gravy. And it was as good a meal as Frank had made all season, though he could not have said exactly why he had put such care into it. Perhaps because supper in bad weather was the one thing a man below decks could control: the warmth of the galley, the weight of the food, the smell of something roasting that cut through the diesel, and the cold, and the particular smell of men who had been working in weather. Perhaps because he understood, without permitting himself to think it through entirely, that there was something in the nature of this particular evening that warranted the effort. The men ate well. They were quieter than usual at supper, not silent, but reduced, the way men get when the world outside is doing something that requires background attention, even when they're trying not to give it. The ship was moving differently now, a longer roll and a deeper one, and occasionally a swell would catch her at a slight angle, and she would shudder through her whole length, and the men would reach for their cups without looking up, the way men do when a thing has happened often enough to become reflex. After supper, Frank cleaned the galley, and then he sat at the table with the last of the coffee and listened. This was something he did most evenings, sat and listened to the ship. A man who had been on the water long enough learned to read a ship through sound the way a doctor reads a body through percussion and auscultation. The engines had their own voice, a deep rhythmic throb that was the Fowler's normal heartbeat, and Frank knew the variations of that voice the way he knew the variations of his own breathing. But it was not the engines he was listening to now. He was listening to the water, through the hull plating, through the kelson and the frames and the oar in the hold, through the whole rigid architecture of the ship. The lake spoke in a low, pervasive register that was not quite a sound and not quite a feeling, but something in between, a vibration that belonged to the water itself, to the way it was moving, and the weight of it, and the distances it was moving from. And what Frank heard in that vibration that evening was different from what he had heard in the morning. He sat with his coffee and listened and did not sleep until well past midnight. The morning of November 8th came in dark and cold and already decided about itself. Frank was up at 4 again, and he had the stove going and the coffee on. But when he looked through the porthole, he couldn't see the water because the spray was flying across the glass in horizontal sheets. The Fowler was moving with an urgency she hadn't had the day before. A pitching, lateral urgency, the bow coming down hard and rising again, and the whole hull shaking with a persistence that was no longer comfortable to ignore. Frank put both hands on the edge of the stove and braced himself and began to scramble eggs. At 5:30, he sent Erickson, the cabin boy, up to the bridge with the captain's coffee and asked him to check the barometer on his way back. Erickson came back 12 minutes later, his hair plastered flat, and his jacket soaked through at the shoulders from the 50 feet of open deck he'd crossed. 28.6, the boy said. He was trying to keep his voice matter-of-fact and not quite managing it. Frank nodded and said nothing. He had expected something in that range. He set Erickson's coffee down in front of him and told him to warm up before he went back out. 28.6 and falling. He had checked the previous evening's reading against the mornings in his head, and the calculation was not encouraging. The system was intensifying faster than low-pressure systems, typically intensified over the Great Lakes in November, which was already saying something, because November on Superior was not a gentle month. The standard models, the ones that the Weather Service worked from, were not always equal to what Superior could generate when a cold Arctic air mass came down from the northwest and ran into the warm, late-season moisture that still sat over the lake in the second week of November. The lake itself became part of the engine. The lake was always part of the engine when it wanted to be. Frank understood this. He understood it in a way that the Weather Service bulletins did not yet fully account for, because he had been here in 1905, and he had been here in 1909, and he had talked to men who had been here in 1905 and 1909 and 1882 and before, and what all of those conversations added up to, what the accumulated testimony of 35 years on this water added up to, was a kind of knowledge that had no official name and no official weight, and therefore counted for nothing in a pilot house. Breakfast was served at 6:30. The men ate, and the ship moved under them, and no one said much about the weather, because there was nothing useful to be said about it at this point. And the men who had been on the lakes long enough knew that, and the men who hadn't were taking their cues from the ones who had. Capstan came off his watch at 8 and stopped by the galley on his way aft. He stood in the doorway, too wet to come inside, and Frank poured him a cup of coffee and held it out to him. Capstan took it and drank it standing in the doorway with the door half open and the wind and the noise coming in around him. glass?" Frank asked. 28-4. Frank said nothing. "He's not turning back," Koppinen said. It was not a question. "No, we're 2/3 of the way to the point. He figures we're better off making the run than turning in this." Koppinen paused. "He might be right. He might be." Koppinen finished the coffee and handed the cup back in through the doorway. He looked at Frank with those careful Finnish eyes that gave nothing away, and then he said, "I've got 12 years on Mosswick. I've been on this lake in worse than this." "So have I," Frank said, "so you know." "Yes, he might be right," Koppinen said again. "He might be," Frank said again. Koppinen nodded once and went aft. Frank turned back to the stove. The ship took a heavy roll to port, and the coffee in the pot moved to one side and then slowly back. And Frank tracked it with one hand without thinking about it. He thought about what Koppinen had said. He might be right. This was the calculation that every man on the ship was making now, whether he knew it or not, weighing the captain's judgment against his own accumulated fear, his own accumulated knowledge, finding the point where those two things met, and deciding which one to trust. Frank had always trusted his own. He had always trusted his own knowledge of this lake over the authority of men who understood ships and routes and cargo schedules better than they understood the particular character of this water, this season, this specific quality of darkness in the northwest sky. And he had been right to trust it, more or less, because he was still here. He was still here. But he had not always been on the ship that was in trouble. He had not always been on the ship. By mid-morning, the storm had taken its first real hold. The waves were running 15 feet now, maybe better. It was hard to judge accurately from the deck, and Frank had only been up twice since breakfast, both times briefly, both times needing one hand for the rail. The Fowler was pitching sharply in a head sea, the bow lifting and then plunging, and the water was coming aboard green over the forward deck. Frank could hear it through the hull, a sound like thunder, but sustained, rhythmic, the sound of the lake climbing the ship. In the galley, everything had to be secured or it moved. Frank had been battening down a kitchen for rough weather since before most of the crew were born. The pots hooked in, the dishware in the rack, the loose items in the drawers, and the drawers latched. He worked through the morning cleaning and securing and beginning the preparations for the noon meal with a measured economy of motion that was mostly automatic, mostly his body doing what it had learned to do over decades of exactly this. But some part of him was somewhere else. Some part of him was on the Mataafa. He had been 26 years old in 1905, and he had been the cook on the Cygnus, which had made it in through the Duluth ship canal on the afternoon of November 28th, just hours before the storm closed the harbor entirely. He had stood on the pier and watched what happened to the ships that didn't make it. He had seen the Mataafa driven onto the north pier and broken, and watched men on the after deck burning oil-soaked rags as signals, because the after end was separated from the forward end by a wall of breaking water, and the men there could not get off the ship, and the rescuers could not get to them. He had watched them signal through the night and into the morning. In the morning, when the storm abated enough for the life-saving crews to reach the ship, they found 9 men dead in the after cabins, frozen, most of them, though some had been caught by water. He had stood on that pier for 6 hours through the worst of it, and he had not been able to do a single useful thing. He had been 26 years old, and he had stood there with his hands at his sides. He thought about those men sometimes the way he thought about other things he carried, without wanting to, without being able to stop. The ship plunged and recovered. Frank kept his feet and went on with the soup. He found the first mate, a man named Cullen, in the passageway outside the engine room at 10:30, coming off an inspection of the shaft alley. Cullen was 40 years old, solid, fair-haired, a man from Sault Ste. Marie, who had grown up on the water. He was not a man who was prone to alarm, but he looked tired in the way a man looks when he has been managing his face against the weather for hours, and the effort is beginning to show. Frank had not planned what he was going to say. He had not precisely decided to seek out the first mate. He had simply found himself in the passageway when Cullen came through the door. "Mr. Cullen." Cullen stopped. He looked at Frank steadily. "I want to say something," Frank said, "and I want you to hear it as something said in good faith and with respect to the captain's authority." "All right," Frank said. "I have been on this lake since 1878. I was in Duluth Harbor in November of 1905. I've seen 2 other storms of this kind come off the northwest in the 2nd week of November, and both times they were worse than the morning forecast suggested. The pattern of the barometer and the character of the swells we're running now are consistent with what I saw in the hours before those storms reached their maximum intensity." Cullen looked at him without expression. He was listening. "I'm not a navigator," Frank said. "I'm not the captain. I know what I am. But I've been cooking on this lake for 35 years, and I have watched weather here my whole life, and I am telling you, as one man telling another man something he believes is true, that what is coming from that northwest sky is not what the morning advisory described. I believe it is worse. I believe it will be significantly worse." The ship took a heavy sea over the bow. The sound of it went through the hull. Cullen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you asking me to do, Dolan?" Frank considered. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said. "I'm telling you what I know. What you do with that is your business." Cullen nodded once. His face had not changed. "The captain has the advisory," Cullen said. "He has the charts. He has the glass." "Yes, sir." "He's made his decision." "Yes, sir." There was a pause. The ship moved. Cullen said, not unkindly, "Go back to your galley, Dolan." Frank went back to his galley. Noon. The soup was thin. He'd had to let it run a little weak, because controlling a full pot in this sea was asking for a burn. But the bread was good, and the men were hungry enough that it didn't matter much. They came in shifts, 3 or 4 at a time, holding the door frame as they came through, and they ate fast and said little and went back out. A deckhand named Lindqvist, who was perhaps 30 and blonde, and had a way of looking at things with a directness that Frank respected, sat down at the table and said, "How bad is it going to be?" The question was addressed to the general vicinity of the table, but it was aimed at Frank. Frank set a bowl of soup in front of him and said, "Eat your dinner." "I've been on this lake 3 seasons," Lindqvist said. "I've never seen it run like it's running today. It runs like that sometimes in November. Worse than this." Frank looked at him. Lindqvist had a direct face to go with his direct eyes, and he was asking honestly, without bravado and without particular fear, in the way a young man asks when he is genuinely trying to understand what he is dealing with. Frank had been that young man once. He had asked the same question of an old cook on the Corunna in the spring of 1879. And the cook, a man from Cleveland named Jasper, who had more years on the lake than Frank had years on Earth, had looked at him with the same appraising look that Frank was now giving Lindqvist, and had said, "Eat your soup." "Eat your soup," Frank said. Lindqvist ate his soup. At 2 in the afternoon, Frank went down to the Lazarette to check the provisions against his list, and to bring up a crate of canned goods that he had been meaning to retrieve since Duluth. The Lazarette was the aftermost compartment in the hold, and to reach it from the galley he had to walk aft through 2 cargo holds, past the oar that sat in the bottom of the ship in its great consolidated mass. 65,000 tons of raw iron ore from the Mesabi Range bound for the steel mills at the lower end of the lakes. The ore didn't move, of course. It was too heavy to move in any ordinary sense. But the space around it moved, and the ship moved in the space around it, and the sound in the hold was different from the sound in the galley or the passageways. It was deeper and more personal. He had been in holds in bad weather before. He had always found them instructive. The Fowler's hull was working. He could hear it in the way the frame spoke, a low, periodic groan that ran down the length of the ship each time she took a heavy sea on the bow, a sound that was entirely normal and part of the expected behavior of a steel hull under stress, but that also carried in it a reminder of what the hull was and what it was being asked to do. It was 600 feet of steel plate, and it was being asked to hold together in the face of something that had no interest in whether it held together or not. He put his hand on the nearest frame and held it there for a moment. The steel was cold under his palm, and the vibration of the ship ran through it, the engine's heartbeat and the water's motion, and the irregular percussion of the seas on the bow. All of it transmitted through the frame into the palm of his hand, and he stood there and felt it the way he sometimes stood at the rail and looked at the horizon, informing himself. That was all. He was a man who had always believed that the first obligation in any situation was to know what was actually happening, without the interference of what you hoped was happening, or what you feared was happening. What was happening was that the Fowler was taking a significant sea, and her hull was responding to it the way it was designed to respond to it. She was a sound ship. He knew that. What he didn't know, what no one knew, because it had not yet happened, was what the storm would look like in 12 hours, or whether the hull's responses at that point would still be entirely within the range of what it had been designed to accommodate. He got his crate and went back forward. Supper was a simple thing. He made a bean soup and a corn bread and sliced cold pork from the previous night's roast. And he made it simple, because simple was what was possible in a rolling galley, where the stove had to be watched every minute, and the pots would slide if he forgot to watch them, and the floor had a wet shine to it from the spray that was finding its way in under the porthole seal. He made it and he served it, and it was adequate, which was what the evening required, not pleasure, not comfort particularly, just fuel and warmth, and the assurance that the galley was still functioning and the routine was intact. Routine mattered on a ship in bad weather. It mattered more than most things. It was one of the things Frank had come to understand over 35 years. That routine was not merely habit, but a kind of statement of intention, a declaration that ordinary life was still being conducted and would continue to be conducted, and that declaration had its own sustaining force. The men who ate his soup and went back to their watches were sustained not just by the calories, but by the fact that supper had happened, that the cook was still cooking, that there were still things functioning as they were supposed to function. This was, as far as Frank was concerned, the truest and most useful thing about his work. He had not always thought of it this way. For the first 20 years, he had thought of himself simply as a man who cooked, because it was what he knew how to do, and it paid tolerably well and kept him on the water, which he'd have been on regardless. Somewhere in his 40s, he had begun to understand that the cooking was also something else, was the ship's version of what a heartbeat is to body. Not the most dramatic function, not the function anyone would choose to explain if they were explaining what a body was and what it could do, but the function on which everything else depended. He ate his own supper standing at the counter, watching the porthole. The light was going outside, the gray afternoon fading to a darker gray that would become black soon enough. He ate without tasting much and thought about the northwest sky, which he couldn't see but could feel through the hull. After supper, the cabin boy Erickson came by the galley and helped with the washing up, which was not strictly his job, but which Frank had tolerated and then come to rely on, because the boy worked quietly and carefully and didn't break things. They worked side by side at the sink in the galley's close warmth, and the ship moved around them, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Erickson said, "How long have you been on the boats, Mr. Dolan?" 35 years, Frank said. "That's a long time." "It is." The boy was quiet again. He dried a pot and put it in the rack with a care that Frank appreciated. Then he said, "Do you ever want to stop?" Frank looked at him sideways. Erickson was 17 and had the serious face of a boy who has been thinking about something specific and has arrived at the point where he needs to hear someone else's answer. "What would you do?" Frank asked. "If you stopped?" "I don't know," Erickson said. "Something on shore. Something that doesn't move." Frank smiled slightly, which was the most his face typically managed in the direction of a smile. "There are a lot of things on shore," he said. "Most of them are all right. But you stayed. I stayed." Why? Frank thought about this honestly. Because it was a question that deserved an honest answer. And because the boy was not asking it lightly. He had asked himself the same question many times over the years. And the answer had changed. Or rather, the way he saw the answer had changed. The way the same landscape looks different depending on what time of year you're standing in it. "I don't know," he said at last. "I think when you're young you stay, because it's easier than leaving, and it pays, and you tell yourself you'll leave next year. And then you're not young anymore, and you've been on the water long enough that the water is more familiar than the land, and leaving doesn't seem like freedom anymore. It just seems like a different kind of being stuck." Erickson thought about this. The ship rolled, and they both caught the counter edge, and then the ship steadied. "Do you regret it?" the boy asked. Frank was quiet for a long time. Outside the porthole, the night was full dark. "I don't think regret is the right word," he said. "It was just what happened. Most of a life is just what happened." They finished the dishes, and Erickson went to his bunk. And Frank sat at the table with the last of the coffee and listened to the lake. The storm announced itself properly at 9 o'clock that evening. Frank knew it the moment it came because the character of the sound changed. Not gradually, the way weather usually comes to its worst, but in a way that had a kind of decision to it, as though the thing that had been building had found its form. The wind went from a sustained roar to something else, something that had a voice in it, a wavering high-frequency note riding on top of the lower frequencies of the hull's response to the sea. The barometric pressure, which Erickson had reported at 28 even at 6 o'clock, was almost certainly lower now. And Frank could feel the difference in a purely physical way. A sensation in the chest, a lightness that was not pleasurable. The Fowler was now taking seas over both the bow and the port side, and she was moving in a way that combined the pitch of a head sea with the roll of a beam sea, a compound motion that was harder on the hull and harder on the men working her than either pure motion would have been. Frank braced himself in the galley and listened to the ship work. The frames were groaning steadily now, and occasionally a wave would hit the hull with enough force that the sound was less like water and more like something being struck with a very large and very deliberate instrument. He made a pot of coffee, stronger than usual, nearly black, and put it in the insulated vessel he used for long watch provisioning, along with a cloth bag of hardtack and a tin of condensed milk. He put on his heaviest jacket and his sou'wester and his rubber boots, and he lashed the provisions bag across his chest and opened the galley door. The wind hit him at the doorway, and he braced against it and moved out into the passageway, one hand always on the bulkhead, moving forward toward the ladder that led to the crew's quarters so he could leave coffee for the watch. The sound outside the hull was enormous, a layered, omnidirectional sound, the kind of sound that has no center, no point of origin, no place that is quieter than any other place, a sound that was simply everywhere. He had been in storms before, He had been in worse storms than this, or so he believed. But each storm had its own character, and this one's character was something he was still reading, still trying to understand. He left coffee for the watch and made his way back to the galley. He did not sleep. The morning of November 9th, Frank made coffee at 4, and he stood at the porthole and could see nothing. The porthole glass was completely obscured by spray and by the foam that was running horizontally across the deck and flying in sheets off the crests of the waves. He didn't try to go up on deck. There was no purpose in it and some real danger. The deck in these conditions was a place that rewarded inattention with permanent consequences. He made coffee, and he made oatmeal, and he heated the hardtack in the oven so it was at least warm, which was about all you could do for hardtack, and he waited for the men to come down for breakfast. Some came, and some didn't. The ones who came ate quickly and without speaking and went back out. Some of the deckhands were clearly exhausted, having spent the night on a ship that was requiring constant attention to keep on her heading. And they ate with the focused, automatic ingestion of men who are feeding a body that is too tired to want food, but is going to need it. Lindqvist came in and sat down without being asked, and Frank gave him a bowl of oatmeal, and they looked at each other for a moment, and then Lindqvist said, "Is this as bad as you've seen?" Frank thought about the true answer, which was, "No, I've seen worse." The Mataafa storm was worse. And then he thought about what that answer meant in this context, and he said, "It's a serious storm." "The hatches are taking water," Lindqvist said. "Not badly, but they're taking water," Frank nodded. "The captain's ordered full steam," Lindqvist said. "We're maybe 8 hours from the point. 8 hours. In this sea, in this wind, with the hatches taking water and the barometer at wherever it was now. 8 hours was a very long time. 8 hours was the kind of time in which a great many things could happen, most of them outside the domain of human decision-making. Frank set another bowl of oatmeal in front of Lindqvist without being asked. "Eat both," he said. Lindqvist ate both. He brought the captain's breakfast up at 7:30. Moswick was in the pilothouse, not in his quarters, and Frank carried the tray up the companionway to the bridge with one hand on the rail and one hand on the tray, and the wind trying to take him sideways at every step. He came through the pilothouse door, and the warmth inside was a physical shock after the brief exposure to the outside air. Moswick was standing at the port wing looking at his instruments and at the windows, which were running with water constantly, the wipers barely keeping a fraction of the glass clear. He had not slept, Frank judged, or if he had slept it had been in the chair at the chart table, which was not really sleep. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had made a decision and was now living inside it and watching what it cost. Frank set the tray on the chart table and said, "Captain." Moswick turned. He looked at Frank, and then at the tray, and then back at the windows. "Barometer?" Frank asked. Moswick looked at him. There was a silence that had several layers to it. 27.9, Moswick said. 27.9. Frank had seen 27.9 before. In November of 1905, before the storm finished, The barometer at the Duluth station had recorded 27.8. This was worse than the morning advisory had predicted, considerably worse, which meant either the advisory had been wrong or the system had intensified in a way that the advisory hadn't anticipated. And either way, it meant that the next 8 hours were going to be different from what the captain had calculated when he decided to continue on yesterday afternoon. Frank said, "Captain, with respect, the system is deeper than the advisory." Moswick looked at him steadily. "We have 8 hours to the point," Frank said. "The hatches are taking water. The glass is 27.9. In November of 1905, the glass at Duluth reached 27.8 at the height of the storm. We are at 27.9 this morning, and the storm is still intensifying." Moswick said nothing. "I am not a navigator," Frank said. "I know that. I'm telling you what I know from 35 years on this water. I'm asking you to consider whether the shelter of the shore is worth 8 more hours of this." Moswick looked at him for a long, waited moment. Then he said, quietly and without hostility, "Are you afraid, Dolan?" Frank thought about this. It was not the question he had expected, and it was not a contemptible question. It deserved consideration. "I have been afraid on this lake before," he said. "Fear is not the same as judgment." "No," Moswick said. "It is not." They regarded each other. Outside, a sea broke over the bow with a sound that went through the Pilothouse glass like something thrown at it. "Thank you for the breakfast," Moswick said. Frank took the tray. Moswick hadn't touched it and went back down to the galley. At 10 in the morning, a wave took the forward starboard capstan. Frank heard it from the galley, not the wave itself, but the consequence of it, a sound that had a different character from the ordinary sounds of seas breaking over the deck, a sound that included the overtone of something structural, something that had been in one place and was now in another place. He heard voices afterward, raised voices, which was more alarming in a way than the sound itself, because the crew of the Fowler were not men who raised their voices without cause. He found out later, from Lindqvist, that the capstan head had been carried away, and that 2 men working the forward deck had been knocked down by the wave. Neither man was lost. Both had been secured to lifelines, but both had been injured, one with a cut to the head that required bandaging, and one with a wrist that was either broken or very badly sprained. Frank treated the wrist, and the head cut in the galley with what he had, which was gauze and tape and carbolic, and a splint improvised from a wooden spoon. He had done more than this on ships before. He had done less. The man with the wrist, a deckhand named Pierce, from Marquette, who was perhaps 25, and who sat very still while Frank worked, and did not say a word, looked at him with the expression of a man who has just understood something about what he is doing with his life, and is not sure what to do with the understanding. "You're going to be all right," Frank told him. Pierce nodded. "Both of you are going to be all right," Frank said, including the other man, who was sitting with a cloth held against his head. Neither of them said anything. Frank wrapped the wrist carefully and secured it, and he thought, "I don't know if that's true. I don't know if either of us is going to be all right. I said it because it is what is said, and because the alternative is saying nothing, and saying nothing is worse. He sent them both to their bunks and went back to the stove. He stood at the stove, and he thought about the names. This was something he had never spoken of to anyone, and something he had never particularly examined in himself, but which had been part of his interior life for most of his adult years. He thought about the names of the men he knew who had not come back from the lake. Not all of them. The lake had taken too many for a single man to hold in his head. But the ones he knew directly, the ones he had shipped with or eaten with or cooked for. James Hector Morin, who had been the first mate on the Corunna in 1882, when she went down in a squall off Pictured Rocks. Frank had been 23, and Morin had been 46. And Morin had always smelled of pipe tobacco, and had told very long, very good stories about the Mississippi River steamboat trade, where he'd worked as a young man. And Frank had spent many hours listening to those stories in the galley of the Corunna. And then one October morning, Morin had not come back, and the stories had ended without an ending. Peter Weil, who had been a deckhand on the Nipigon and had drowned in the Keweenaw waterway in 1891 when a line had taken him overboard. He had been 22 years old and had been married 7 months, Carl and Anton Björk, brothers from Duluth, who had been on the Presqu'Isle when she stranded in November of 1901. Carl had made it. Anton had not. Frank had seen Carl Björk in a bar in Superior 2 years after that, and Carl had not spoken much and drank steadily and left before Frank did. And Frank had heard the following spring that Carl had signed off the lakes and gone to work in a mine in Minnesota, and had never gone back on the water Henry Frisch. Oswald Lake, the Larson boy from Ashland, whose first name Frank could no longer remember, and that bothered him. He stood at the stove in the roaring, shaking galley of the Constance Fowler, and tried to remember the Larson boy's first name, and could not. And the trying felt like the only thing he could do for any of them. The worst of it came at noon on the 9th. Frank knew it was the worst of it, not because anything particularly definitive happened at noon. The storm had been building, and the hour was simply the hour the building reached its point of maximum expression. But because he could feel it in the ship in a way that he could not misinterpret. The Fowler was laboring. That was the only word for it. A word that implied an organism doing something at the edge of its capacity. And the ship was at the edge of her capacity, or close enough to it that the difference was not reassuring. The hatches forward were taking water consistently now. The oar in the hold was not in any danger, or did not behave like grain or timber when it got wet, and the Fowler had ridden out bad seas before, but the water in the cargo hold was not purely a structural issue. It was also a navigational one, a matter of trim and stability. Frank was not an engineer, and he was not a navigator, and he could not perform the calculations that the chief engineer and the first mate were presumably performing right now. But he had been on this lake long enough to understand the relationships between a loaded hull and a following sea and stability. And none of those relationships were currently being expressed in ways that he found reassuring. He stayed in the galley. There was nothing he could do that was not being done, and the galley was where his usefulness lived. He made soup, a thin one, because anything thicker was a liability in this motion. And he kept the coffee going, and he kept the stove burning, and he kept his feet under him through a discipline of attention and muscle that left no room for anything else. He had been afraid before, on this lake and on others. He had been afraid in ways that led him to pray, which he did infrequently and without great confidence, and in ways that led him merely to make lists in his head of the things that needed doing, which was more reliable and had a better rate of return. He was doing the second thing now. There was coffee to make and soup to mind and a fire to keep. There was a ship under his feet that needed him to keep functioning. He kept functioning. The storm hammered at the hull, and the ship shook, and the frames groaned, and the light through the porthole was the color of nothing. And Frank stood at the stove and tended his fire. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of November 9th, the barometer began to rise. It rose slowly and then faster, and by 5 o'clock it was at 28.2 and still climbing, and the seas that had been running 20 feet at noon began to flatten, not quickly. The lake did not give up its storms quickly, but perceptibly, the way a face changes when the worst of a crisis passes, still grave, but no longer fixed in that particular expression of absolute concentration. Frank noted the change through the hull and through the porthole before he noted the barometric reading, because his instruments were older than glass and mercury and had more years of calibration behind them. He felt the ship's motion change, the period of the roll lengthening, the pitch becoming less severe, and he put his hand on the hull for a moment and felt what he had always felt, which was the lake talking through steel, and what it was saying now was different from what it had been saying 3 hours before. He did not relax. He did not permit himself anything that could be described as relief. He knew this lake. He knew that the passing of the worst did not mean the end, and that ships had gone down in the aftermath of storms, in the confused seas that follow when the wind direction shifts, or in the brief second intensification that sometimes followed the passage of a low center, or simply in the accumulation of damage and fatigue and decisions made in the first 12 hours of a storm, whose cost was only tallied at the end. He made coffee. He made it strong, and he heated up the remains of the bean soup from the previous evening, and he put out bread and cold pork and the tin of condensed milk, and he let the word go forward through the ship that supper was available, and that any man who could eat should come and eat. They came, not all at once, not in the orderly shifts of a normal mealtimes, but ones and twos through the evening. Men who came in off the deck or out of the engine room or down from the bridge. And they sat at the table and they ate, and the galley was warm. And Frank served them and kept the coffee going and watched their faces settle, one by one, into something that was less than normalcy, but in the direction of it. Lindqvist came in last and ate 2 bowls of soup and half a loaf of bread, and didn't say a word the whole time. And when he was done, he looked up at Frank, and Frank looked back at him, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to be said that would be more accurate than the silence. The Constance Fowler passed through Whitefish Bay and into the St. Mary's River, and came alongside the Sioux Locks on the morning of November 10th. The storm was spent. The sky over the lower lake was high and pale, and the temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a skin of new ice on the still water at the edges of the river. The crew moved around the ship with the particular economy of men who are more tired than they know, whose bodies have been working at a sustained alertness for 48 hours, and are now, in the absence of immediate danger, beginning to register the cost. Frank cooked a full breakfast: eggs and salt pork and fried potatoes and bread, and the coffee going without interruption from the moment he was up. He cooked it as carefully as he cooked anything, and he set it out properly, and the men came down and ate, and it was as good a breakfast as he had made all season, and it was the right breakfast for the morning after what the morning was after. Moswick came down from the bridge at 9 o'clock and sat at the table, which he had not done in Frank's memory. He sat, and Frank set a plate in front of him, and the captain ate without speaking for several minutes. Then he said to the table in general, or perhaps to Frank in particular, "We lost the capstan. Pierce's wrist will need a proper doctor." Frank said, "Yes, sir." Moswick ate some more. Then he said, "The Weather Service recorded the storm as a record low for this section of the lake for November. 27.7 at the Whitefish Point Station." Frank said nothing. "They're calling it the Great Lakes Storm of 1913, Moswick said. "Already calling it that. As of this morning, they're accounting for 8 ships missing on Superior and Huron. Maybe more." Frank absorbed this. 8 ships. He thought of the names of those ships, which he didn't yet know. He thought of the men on them, whose names he also didn't know. He thought of the men he had been thinking about in the galley yesterday, Morin and Weil, and the Björk brothers, and the Larson boy whose first name he couldn't remember. And he thought about how the list he'd been carrying in his head for 35 years was about to get longer in ways he didn't yet know the shape of. "I'm sorry," Moswick said. He said it quietly and without any particular framing, as though he were making a statement of fact. It was not entirely clear what he was apologizing for. Frank thought about this. He thought about the conversation in the Pilothouse. "I am not a navigator, I know that," and about Cullen's face in the passageway, "Go back to your galley, Dolan," and about the letter he had written to Ruth sitting in his notebook, the letter about fixing the fence and driving to Minneapolis, the letter that said nothing about what he knew. "No need for that, sir," Frank said. Moswick finished his breakfast and stood up, and Frank took the plate, and neither of them said anything else. He mailed the letter to Ruth at the post office in Sault Ste. Marie. He walked to the post office from the dock through streets that were cold and quiet and smelled of wood smoke and coal, and he stood at the counter and bought a stamp from a woman who looked at him with the mild, focused attention of a person doing a simple job. And he put the stamp on the envelope and pushed it across the counter and she took it without ceremony and dropped it in the outgoing basket. He stood outside the post office for a while in the cold air. The sky was clear now, a hard November blue, and the sun was low, and the shadows were long, and everything had the slightly unreal sharpness of a landscape scene after a long period of not seeing anything clearly. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, and he breathed the cold air, and he thought about the fence that needed mending, and the drive to Minneapolis and Ruth's hands around her coffee cup. He thought about Moswick's apology and what it had meant. He had been thinking about it since breakfast. It seemed to him, turning it over in his mind in the cold outside the Salt Stee. Marie Post Office, that what Moswick had been apologizing for was not precisely what a man would apologize for if he had simply made a bad decision. It was more than that. It had the character of an apology for the whole arrangement of things, for the shipping company's schedules, and the weather service's advisories, and the hierarchy of knowledge and authority on a working ship, and the way a cook's 35 years of watching a lake could not officially count as evidence in a pilot house. Frank did not think the apology was wrong, exactly. He did not think it was adequate, either. It was simply what could be said by the kind of man Moswick was, in the circumstances. And Frank had been on this lake long enough to know that what could be said, and what needed to be said, were almost never the same thing, and that holding the difference against a person was a luxury that none of them could afford. He would sail again in April. He knew this the way he knew the other things he knew, through the body, through accumulated habit, through the particular constitution of a man for whom the decision had been made so many times that it was no longer quite a decision. Ruth would ask him again, quietly, without pressure, and he would think about the fence and Minneapolis and her hands around the coffee cup. He would think about Morin and Weil and the Larson boy and the 8 ships whose names he didn't yet know. He would think about all of it with the attention it deserved. And then he would go back out in April. He put up his collar against the cold and began the walk back to the dock. And the sky above the St. Mary's River was the deep, uncompromising blue of a November that has finished saying what it had to say. And the shadows were long on the ground, and his footsteps were the only footsteps on the street. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.